Time to begin. Brack Reed, our regular chair, is not going to be with us today. So my name is Charles Frazier, Vice Chair, so I'll be chairing the meeting today. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And first order of business will be approval of last meeting's minutes on November 28th. And do we have a motion to approve those minutes? Move to approve. Okay, second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. And opposed? All right. We had an item of unfinished business. Hey, you just in time. Item of unfinished business. And I guess the auditor's going to be talking about Seth. No, I guess Seth, you're going to do it. The discussion on the audit of the Office of Fleet Management. Their audit report issued September 18th.
Yeah, I believe everyone was here last time, so just kind of want to go over the open items. Tonight we have Nancy Whitmore and Robert Barlow and Stacy Wall. Sorry, I went late. So we were camped out at OFM for a couple months. Stacy and his team were really good to us while we were there. So the first item that was brought up last week was the vendor repairs and kind of some questions around that. So like I said before, we took a sample of invoices and looked at kind of the average time that those were taking to be completed. It was 9 days. We thought that was reasonable. We also took the total actual expenses of the 3 shops, and we looked at the total third-party repair expenditure, and it was only about 6% of the total expenditure. So we thought that was, again, another reasonable, so that's why there was an observation. We thought all of that was within reason. Outside of that, there was questions around turnaround time and utilization. So I don't know if you all remember the questions you had, but they are here, and I'm here as well to address any of those.
I'll follow up with my question or comment from last time. I had asked Nancy if the audit included a review of the third-party work, because I received anecdotal kind of feedback from departments around turnaround time and things like that, and I wanted to know if the audit covered that, because I didn't see findings about that. So whether or not that would validate that everything, if that meant that everything was in order and you didn't see anything particularly out of line in terms of industry standards, because there was not a specific note about it in the audit.
And that's okay. On page 19 of your workbook, we put in some of the work that we had done related to that, but a lot of that was, as one of the things I mentioned, the EBS was not the best system, and because of that, a lot of the data on the work tickets, you'll see, we just put the numbers that are here. There wasn't much you could do, because there's some work tickets that show 700 days from open to close in the system, but a lot of that, I think, is just it didn't get closed, and when they saw that it's there, it got closed on that date. And
I was viewing the fact that there wasn't necessarily an audit in there, that was good news. Yeah,
and a lot of that was because the data, the old system just doesn't give you the information it needed. That's to help you understand why they needed the new system. The faster system is going to do a lot better job. It's designed to manage fleet shops. EBS was not designed to manage fleet shops, and so that we looked at it at a very high level, because we didn't put a lot of faith in the numbers that we saw. If we took the numbers purely as they are, you got an average of average calendar days of 41 days for everything that was outsourced, went out to outside repairs, which that includes 700 days in there, and so that's a good way to. But most of it, I think
I got some information.
Give you better data on that.
First of all, I want to apologize for us not being here last time. That was an oversight on my side, and I apologize, but we're here to answer your questions. And also, I just want to say that we always welcome audits. I've said this to Mark and his staff many, many times. We're not perfect, and we also like to get feedback. We were very pleased with this audit that we didn't have any findings, but we had recommendations. And out of those recommendations, before the audit was actually issued, we had already completed a third of those as far as moving forward with what the recommendations are. And then on September the 20th, I just wanted to share with the audit committee that I sent out an email to Stacy Wall, who is the assistant director for fleet, directing him to move forward with the audit recommendations. As they were saying, the old system that we were on was the EBS system. It did not track the kind of turnaround that we would like to see. So the new system is tracking that now. And so just to give you an example, the new system was implemented in March of this year. 93% of the equipment was done in-house. Only 7% was sent out to vendors. And out of that 7%, less than one day, let me make sure I have my numbers right here. Less than one day, 13% of that 7% was at vendors. 5% was 1 to 2 days, and then 82% was more than 2 days. Now, also remember that this includes wrecked cars. So anytime we have a vehicle that's been wrecked, it's going to take longer to get that fixed, and sometimes we have to put it on hold because of budget issues. So there's some factors that may deal with those wrecked cars. And then we have some vehicles or pieces of equipment that we have to order parts, and sometimes that can take longer than we would like for it to.
I have one question. So I think we were talking about utilization, and there was some discussion about authority versus obligation. And so I think there was one department where the utilization rate was around 22%, which seems low, right?
Was it assessor of property?
I wasn't going to embarrass anybody.
No, I'm sorry.
We aren't being televised. And so is it the sense of the department that there's an obligation to manage utilization or just authority?
Well, we track utilization because it's very important to us as we're looking at our replacement every year, what vehicles are being utilized. We have discussions with departments at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, about utilization rates. We talk to them about how they can better manage their fleet. If you have a vehicle that has high mileage and one with low mileage, then start using the vehicle with the lower mileage. We have also, as we have conversations with the finance department during budget time, we're always looking at, is there a way to reduce the fleet? And but then you have departments who take a hard line. You know, we need these vehicles. Some of them are seasonal. We think there's ways that we could manage that more efficiently, but sometimes it's difficult to get past people sharing. And so we have or department sharing, we have started to put some programs in place to show that sharing does work, and that's our electric vehicles, that we are sharing those on different campuses. We have them at Lentz Health Department, we have at Public Works, we have them at Fulton campus, we'll have them here at the courthouse. And so it's just a way to show and to track that data to show how we can share vehicles. We also think there's a way to share equipment too.
Yeah. Well, it just seems to me, I'm just thinking about how a budget presentation goes at the council. I mean, I'm not sure it makes sense for each department to be interrogated about their vehicles, but if they're going to have a veto over how many vehicles they get or how they get used, then I guess we have to, because that's the only way to maximize the utility of having a fleet at all, right?
Right. We're more than happy to make recommendations and to share those if people are interested in from our perspective, but you also have to take into consideration programmatic needs or departmental needs. So we're looking at it purely from a fleet perspective, but we're happy to, during the budget process, to make some recommendations for council and the budget office to explore. Maybe
some sort of performance measure of how we could, some goal for reducing the fleet, and how, that would be a way for you to have a stick when it comes to the departments to say that the council has indicated you have to reduce the fleet by 10% over X years, and so here's how we're doing it. Sorry. because it doesn't make, it frankly makes, it's just not productive to have whatever it was, however many vehicles sitting one place waiting for them to be used when people go out to do the inspections. That's just not, that's not a good use of the money we have.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I can only speak for 1 out of 40 council members, but I think it's fair to say that everybody would probably rather reach an agreement with your department about how that's going to work rather than get legislated on it. And, you know, now that there's been this audit finding, I mean, I'd be in favor of pursuing legislation if departments can't figure out how to be more cooperative. So,
I'm just listening.
I mean, I guess that's, I mean, I'm sure Mr. Swan could affirm, you know, I've been on this committee pretty aggressive about follow-up on audit findings, and this isn't one that I'm willing to just, you know, let go till the audit happens again in a few years. So I'd really like it if the departments could, I mean, it sounds like you guys think there's room for improvement. I'd like to see that happening voluntarily rather than us having to legislate it.
I mean, when you think about pieces of equipment sometimes setting, you know, can we share bucket trucks? I'm just using that as an example. I'm not saying that's something that we should share. But, you know, if one department has it, it's almost like a car rental or equipment rental where people check out or schedule their equipment to be used. So we have some ideas. We can look at best practices also and come forward with those, and then we can make our recommendations. Again, it would be purely on the fleet side, and that, you know, folks would have to take into consideration the departments, their, you know, why they feel it, from a programmatic side, you know, why it should be different.
Sure.
But we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
That just raises a question for me. In terms of take-home vehicles, has there been any change in the number of take-home vehicles over the past few years? Because I do know that there was an effort once upon a time to really reduce the number of take-home vehicles. I'm sitting on that right now.
Well, I'll have to get you the numbers, but we do have, we do track take-home vehicles every year. We ask departments who have, the department heads who they've assigned take-home vehicles for. Of course, the police department has the majority of them, and I think we all know why that they, you know, why they want to do that. But overall, departments have reduced that, but we do have take-home vehicles. Fire department has some, and, you know, it's a, you know, looking at the criteria and why they're taken home. I mean, again, that's an analysis or an evaluation that, you know, could be looked at to see if there's a way to reduce those.
It was not within your scope.
No, we had a comment about that. Well, whether one of there's the general services order that addresses the criteria for take-home vehicles, and, you know, we were able to identify some vehicles that may not fit exactly into that, but there's an exception process to get the Director of General Services approval for those exceptions. And so we figured the best way to handle that is we do departmental audits going forward. We would be starting to look at that and ask if it doesn't meet the criteria, then we're going to ask for their exception. If they haven't, then you'll see a recommendation that they go get the exception justified by the Director of General Services.
And we have in our audit response, I don't know if you all received a copy of that, but there is a list of all the take-home vehicles at the time of the audit. I have those I have extra copies with me if anyone would like to have a copy.
Did you know I was going to ask about take-home vehicles?
But there's
How did you know that? She read my
you want that?
all the C's. Okay. I don't think I saw
Any other questions? I noticed also that on page 14 and following, there are quite a few recommendations that they've suggested in June 2018, right, that's going to be looked at again. Okay, very good.
And we're working on those recommendations now, and we will have, our intent is to have all those completed by that date.
Okay, very good. Any other comments? Do we need a motion to accept the report? Or we okay. on to new business, discussion of the ongoing audit. Thank you so much, by the way.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming.
That would be me.
That would be you. Oh, you need first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
A couple of questions I want to ask. This shouldn't take
All right. Well, I do want to report that the Metro audit has been completed for a while, and it was held open for the issuance of Metro Nashville General Hospital, and that's been approved and it has been released final. So now that's done, and Bruce Naremore's here. He's the CFO of the hospital. I also have copies of that finalized audit with me, and I'll hand those out as well. But with that, what I'm going to do is cover this booklet, and it is in regard to the required communications of Metro's CAFR and the related audit, and as are required under the auditing standards. And then we'll touch on some highlights in the CAFR, just some of the overarching highlights that are reflected in there as far as the results and the footprint of those financial statements. So after the agenda team members, there were no changes in the proposed plan, and the members that conducted that plan from a management standpoint. And you can see that those are listed here. Now, next year there will be, Dan Miller will take over as principal in charge, and then I will move to more of a second partner pre-issuance review standpoint or position. Lindsay is the supervisor in charge of the field work, and she will remain that next year. But there are a number of other people involved, as you can see, the various components of it, and those are listed here. Responsibilities on page 4. Our responsibilities as the external auditors is to express opinion as to whether the financial statements are really stated in all material respects. We do that in accordance with general accepted auditing standards, as well as governmental auditing standards, and then the regulations under uniform guidance, which are the regulations that guide the compliance of your federal grants, and so we test those as well. We then base our opinion based on the procedures that are set forth by those standards. We maintain independence and an attitude of skepticism throughout the audit, and then finally we are charged to report to this committee as representatives of the governing body. Management of Metro's responsibilities are to fairly present the financial statements in conformity with GAAP, adopt the proper accounting policies, establish and maintain effective internal control, prevent and detect fraud, and then disclose to you, this committee, and to us any significant deficiencies in internal control that they noted or that they know of, and any fraud that they may become aware of. And so all those things are both of our responsibilities. Independence on page 5. We are to be independent with regard to Metro, and we are under the AICPA's Code of Professional Conduct and governmental auditing standards. We know of no conflicts of interest or anything that would impair our independence or conflict with that. Page 6, fraud risk is part of our procedures. We're to specifically address the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. And to do that, we have a four-pronged attack. We gather information, which includes brainstorming. Our group will get together and discuss the areas in which fraud would be more susceptible or easier to perpetrate in an environment such as the government and various other things, ways to gather information. We test for management override. We test management journal entries that are manual journal entries that are not part of the actual system. So we'll test those to make sure that the propriety of those is good. We respond and identify any risks as we gather this information, and then we would evaluate any audit evidence. So if we determine that we did believe that there may be fraud, that evidence would be gathered, and then we would communicate with the appropriate levels of management and then this committee to address what we believe could be a fraud. Deliverables. The CAFR is complete and will be, upon your approval tonight, will be printed. General hospitals are now, it says in process, but is no longer in process, so those are issued. Internal school funds, the report is in process, the audit and the numbers are complete, and then the single audit is still in process, and that will continue for probably a couple more weeks, and then we will issue that. Other deliverables, this required communication, which we're doing tonight, the management letter. And the management letter we hold open until the single audit is complete in case there are any things that from that we need to include in that. But I can tell you from a management letter standpoint, for the financial audit, for the CAFR itself, we have no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, things that would rise to those levels that would have to be reported. Now, we will have a management letter that has some suggestions and things, but they will not, none of those will rise to those two levels. And then whatever we find in the single audit that would be internal control related, we would include in that letter as well. And then after the single audit is completed, we will file the data collection form with the Federal Clearinghouse and submit the A130, or what is now Uniform Guidance version of the audit. Page 8 is the audit methodology. There was no changes here in that methodology or approach that we described to you in the planning meeting that we had with you. So there was nothing unusual that came up during the course of the audit that made us change direction or made us change our overall plan or make any significant modifications to that plan. Page 9, audit methodology and approach. It included these areas that we identified on the outset as higher risk. The control areas that are your transaction cycles on the left. We tested all those, and like I said, we really had no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies to report from that testing. Substantive tests are the tests of your actual balances that go into the CAFR, and we conducted those tests as well. Based on those tests, we have given an unmodified opinion, so a clean opinion with no exceptions. Single audit on page 10. As I said, this is ongoing. You do not qualify as low-risk auditees who are required to test or at least have 40% coverage of your total federal expenditures, which are approximately $175 million. Based on that coverage requirement, we were required to test 4 major programs, and those are listed there: Head Start, Child Nutrition, WIC, and then the Workforce Innovation programs. And so those are ongoing as we speak.
David, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
We did not qualify as low risk, so just what does it take?
High risk.
Yeah, right. I know.
Yeah.
What does it take?
Well,
what are the criteria for low
what
risk?
kicked you over was we had the material weakness with the hospital, and that if you have a material weakness that's included, within the scope of your CAFR, then that prevents you automatically from being low risk. So when we eliminate that, then we'll
How many years has it been? Is this new?
What was the issue?
And the going concern.
The going concern, right?
Going concern.
Yeah.
But then in prior years, was it the same?
Well, it's been high risk as long as we had that. We were low risk for a couple of years, and then
Last 2, 3, we've been.
yeah, and then it went back to the high risk status. Really, actually, it probably would not have made a significant difference in the number of programs that we had to test this particular current year. Some years it would, some years it doesn't, just depending on how the numbers fall and you know what programs that you've tested recently over the last 2 years versus what you haven't tested in longer than 2 years. So if one of those programs is particularly big, you might get some coverage without having to test as many programs. So it's kind of a complicated formula. So it doesn't necessarily always coincide with if you're high risk, you're going to have to test a lot more than if you're low risk.
And that doesn't affect bond ratings or?
No. It's just the number of programs as far as, you know, what you have to select to conduct your testing for. Significant activities and unusual items, pretty traditional from the standpoint of, you know, new debt, capital projects, et cetera. And of course, the hospital authority has been an ongoing matter with the going concern, and then grant testing that we have spoken of. So those are kind of some of the more significant areas in the audit process. Accounting pronouncements adopted, starting on page 12. None of these really had any significant impact for Metro this year. These are the ones that were required to be adopted this year. They were just revisions of your pension standard, but nothing that made any real significant, few disclosure little items, but nothing that affected the county or made any significant changes to the way you present your pension data. Now, 74 was for OPEB. Now, this was the disclosure one that kind of mirrored 68. 68 did have a large impact to your CAFR from a disclosure standpoint, and then 69 was the actual, or 67 did. 68 was the actual adoption that changed the accounting for pension. So 74 and 75 are the same types of standards for your OPEB plan. Well, 74 did not have an impact, unlike 67, because you do not have a separate OPEB trust. So the actual standard is not applicable to Metro because they didn't have a trust that was established for the assets of that plan. Now, 75 will have the same similar effect that 68 did from the standpoint that it will affect the accounting. It will be a significant increase in the liability that's included in the CAFR for the OPEB liability. So
75 will be applicable to this
next year, right? Yeah. So it'll be significant. Now, your ARC is already is a pretty good size liability as it is, but then instead of that, what'll go there is your actual OPEB liability. So there'll be an increase. I don't know. It's probably about $1 million is what I'm guessing between the ARC and the billion. Excuse me. Between what's a zero on but yeah, an increase of about $1 billion from the current liability that's on there now. So the ARC will go off, the liability go on, and the difference is about $1 billion. And so it'll increase that liability, reduce your debt position by that amount. So be a significant impact on the statement of financial position.
So I ask you guys this every 6 months. 2 years ago, I asked when the net position gets hit by that, and it ends up being a negative number about, technically that triggering going concern, and you said industry's still working on it.
Yeah, I don't think there's been, because it's not been adopted yet. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of, I don't think anybody's really taken the standard position, that I've heard of, that's kind of in force. This is what everybody's going to do kind of thing. But I can't imagine that that in itself would create, for an otherwise, or an entity or an organization or a government that's otherwise has no issues with, determining whether they're a going concern or not, I don't think that would kick them into that position because it's a long-term liability, and you're funding it the same way you were you're funding it before, kind of as you go on an as-you-go basis. So, as long as there was no issues in the funding on an annual basis, I can't imagine that we couldn't evaluate going concern where it would really not have the impact of kicking it into that situation.
So
that's my personal take on it, and I think my partners would agree with that. So I think that's.
So when will that play out from, that's my personal take, to, we're here a year from today?
Well, I mean, I'd like to see kind of what the industry does, as well, but I'm pretty sure that'll be our position. Unless every government in America or whatever decides, okay, we're going the other way, then obviously, we're going to follow industry practice. But I don't think that'll be the case.
Do you guys have a sense of when industry practice will take form?
Well, as this thing is adopted in the upcoming year, I mean, everybody's going to have to decide, and those decisions will have to be made. So I would think there'll be a lot of discussion probably prior to June 30, when these things will start those decisions start having to be made. So
thanks.
Yeah.
Is there an industry practice on a trust fund, establishing a trust fund? Is that detected?
Well, no. I mean, different governments do different things. It just depends. I mean, you'll see some with pension trust funds, some without, some with OPEB trust funds, some without. Just those are decisions to be made by management and the councils of these independent governments.
Well, given your proximity to industry practice is closer than ours, if at some point you had some information on how many municipalities.
Sure, we could gather that information. That's not a problem.
I think that would be useful.
Yeah, sure.
An OPEB.
On OPEB, yeah. Yeah, you have one for your pension, but
Not many is the answer, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
probably.
I mean, the majority of governments have, when they have pension, they have a pension trust fund.
Right.
It's the opposite for OPEB.
Not many.
Not as many, right?
I think part of that is because of OPEB, you can change your medical benefits to some degree. It's not, you could make the deductible higher, change the mix, so you could almost force people out.
The plan can get changed.
And most every government has a pension plan.
Yeah,
Not every
it's a lot harder to change.
Yeah, not every government has a significant OPEB plan. We do a number of cities in Tennessee. Most have some type of OPEB plan, but some are much more significant than others, just depending on the benefits that have been offered.
David, this is something you probably mentioned, we talked about earlier, but as far as the pension and OPEB, is the overfunding or underfunding this about the same from year to year? It doesn't change much as far as assets and liability.
Well, you actually don't have any assets set aside for your OPEB plan. It's an unfunded plan. You basically are funding it as you go. Now, the required contribution each year has been underfunded, actually. That's why you have what's called the ARC, and that is reflected as a liability currently on your government-wide statements. But there are no assets.
Annual required contribution.
Contribution, yeah.
Thanks. I'm glad you asked.
That was a good question.
So if you underfund that annual required contribution, then that aggregate buildup is accrued and it's recorded as an obligation under the current standards on your government-wide statement. So that's what the $1.5 billion is on there now.
So the ARC is $1.5 billion, which is underfunded from past years.
Exactly.
Okay.
And on page 15 is a discussion of your, the underfunded status. It's not funded. So we're just letting you know that you're basically going to have an obligation of, somewhere around 2.3 to 2.5 billion, probably most likely, a net OPEB obligation. Currently, your ARC is at $1.5 million, so it's about, like we said, about a $1 billion increase there. Page 16, additional required communications. There are certain balances in CAFR that require management to make estimates, such as collected receivables, the useful lives of your capital assets, because those have to be depreciated over their useful lives. So management makes those decisions. We evaluate those estimates to make sure that they appear appropriate and are where they should be in relation to the balance that they relate to. Unaudited information in the CAFR, we would read such information such as MD&A, that type of thing, and to make sure that it does not conflict with the audited statements or their disclosures. Other items, there was no transactions, which was a lack of authoritative guidance that we noted. All significant transactions were recognized in the proper period, so cutoff was proper. No alternative accounting policies or practices related to material items were noted. No difficulties encountered in dealing with management and performing or completing our audit. It went very smoothly, as it usually does. Management here is always prepared and does a great job in providing us the information we need to conduct the audit process, our audit procedures and process. We had no disagreements with management regarding accounting treatments or how to record anything with the proper type of transaction to be recorded was. Management provided appropriate representations at the conclusion of the audit. That's the representation letter. And then we're not aware of any communications by management with other independent accountants. It's okay if they make those inquiries with other accountants, look for a second opinion, if you will. But if they do, they need to let us know so we can evaluate the accounting treatment. But to our knowledge, there was no such inquiries. Page 17, unrecorded audited differences. There were none for either the governmental activities or the business type activities, so we had no past entries to report to you that were not made by management. On page 18 are upcoming accounting developments. So these are standards that will be required to be adopted over the next few years, and you can see some of those listed there. Most of those will have minimal effect on Metro's CAFR, with the exception of 75, the very first one, which is the one that we have been talking about. So that one will have a much more significant impact. The rest of them will probably not be material adoptions of standards. And then lastly, the contacts of the people that I mentioned earlier are listed here as well. So that is the required communications. As far as the CAFR itself, I know you've all had it for quite a while. If you have any specific questions, we can try to answer those questions. I mean, just to hit some of the highlights in the CAFR, the total assets for the government, the government-wide statements were approximately $8.2 billion, which is about the same, pretty consistent with the prior year. Component units were up slightly to $4.7 billion from $4.5 billion. As far as liabilities for the government, for the governmental activities, $7.6 billion were the liabilities. And for the component units, about $2.6 billion, which is about the same as the prior. The liabilities were actually up slightly from $7.3 billion in the prior, so about $300 million increase. Net position, there was a negative position at the end of the year of $714 million for the governmental activities, and positive for the business type activities of $1.3 billion. Your net position for the component units was a positive $2.1 billion. And then you had fiduciary net position, which is your pension trust funds of approximately $3 billion. So you can see that is the offset to your actual pension obligation. Now, you still have a net pension obligation of, what is it, Dan, about $200 million, somewhere around there? Yeah. And so...
Is that about the same? I mean, is that consistent with year to year?
Yeah, I don't think that's not significantly different, no. And you had such a good year. Actually, it went down pretty significantly because you had such a good year in your investments. So there was, I said it's not consistent. It was a significant decrease in that obligation because of the investment performance. So as long as the market stays good, things get better. If it goes bad, then that liability creeps back up. It's all about fair value of the underlying investments.
Our vice chair hasn't asked about year over year about the unfunded OPEB obligation, about how that's going. Maybe you could characterize that for him.
Well, Metro took several steps a few years ago to try to reduce that obligation or slow it down as far as the growth of that. And so there were some changes that were made in the eligibility for being a participant in the plan. I think the vesting period went from 5 years to 10 years. And there were some other changes that were an attempt to slow the increase of that obligation down and stretch it out a little bit. So
it's accelerating.
Yeah, it still accelerates. Yeah, I mean, as folks get older and And the city employees grow, the population, of the employees of the city grow. I mean, there's things that consistently make that obligation continue to increase.
The number of employees is not generally increasing. I mean, we have this.
Right.
I have a couple. Can I ask? Because I do have to go outside in a second. Were you finished? Were you?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
So the the general fund undesignated fund balance is it in compliance with the 5%?
Yes, and I was going to move on to the fund balances. General fund balance is $107 million. And your total governmental funds fund balance is $136 million. So yes,
it's in excess of 5%, which I think is the policy.
Right.
How far in excess of 5%?
I don't know offhand without looking at the actual numbers.
It's right at 5.05,
right.
something like
I mean, it's not way over it,
right.
But it has exceeded it.
And the history of that policy is that I think in the late 80s, when we had budget shortfalls, the bond rating agencies encouraged us by ordinance to adopt a policy that maintains that undesignated general fund balance at 5% or greater, and we have very frequently gone below it, I think, and only for very short periods of time when we have.
And I would add that the finance department actually extended that same policy to the debt service funds beyond what was required in the ordinance.
Okay. And then I have
additional protections.
I have a couple of, I dare say, relatively specific questions about the hospital authority audit we got today. So and it relates to notes D, E, and F, really. And the hospital authority may have to answer these questions. So I'm trying to figure out what the difference between a self-pay patient and a charity patient is.
I'll let management deal with this.
Charity pay patient is a patient that has been qualified for charity, so they've been deemed and designated and gone through a process to meet those criteria. So that's truly a charity patient. A self-pay patient can be someone who presents, does not participate in going through that charity process, or even people like us that have insurance but don't pay a particular balance that's out there outstanding, that's our deductible, copay, et cetera. So it's a variety of numbers, but that is a distinction between charity and self-pay.
Okay. So if you look at footnote F, which is the charity care footnote, in the non-accountant understanding of something like this, the way I look at this, it seems like for the charity care, the people who've been qualified as deserving of charity, we billed them $40 million in care.
That's charges, yeah.
Charges. So much we would have billed them.
Those are charges foregone, though. They're not included in the gross revenue.
Right, that's how much we would have billed them, right? If they had just walked in and had insurance or not qualified. But if they had insurance or had been self-pay, we would have discounted the total charges to $15 million. Is that right?
That sounds about right. I mean,
So I guess the question, I mean, for the average person looking at this, you would say we could have purchased that same care at another facility for those same people for $15 million.
If their cost structure was the same as general hospitals?
I mean, does that consider, Bruce, would that consider, contractual adjustments? Is that taking into consideration what most contractual adjustments would be and, on insurance payments or anything like that? Or?
General, our ratio cost to charges, I don't want to get real technical here, is it costs us about 40 cents on the dollar to deliver a service. If you were, and I'm not picking on anybody, I've been at other hospitals too, Vanderbilt's probably 18 or 20%, so their costs are relatively higher. Their charges are so much higher than general's on average. And so that same number might be different. Vanderbilt might charge $80 million for that same $40 million worth of care. Just different charge structure.
They might charge 80%, but then only expect to get paid 18%.
Possibly.
Because basically everybody's going by CMS's reimbursement numbers, right?
Most reimbursements were some reflection of CMS reimbursement, yes.
So if the hospital authority wants $50 million, the other 35, I guess I'm just, from a layperson, saying, if we could have just bought the charity care at another hospital for 15 or 16 or even $20 million, the other 30 then is going where?
Well, you just said there are other patients in general that do not qualify for charity care because they either don't participate, they come into the ER, or they have surgery, or they're a non-resident alien. We get some patients like that. They don't qualify for charity care as it's designed here.
Who makes that determination about whether or not they're eligible for charity care?
We have a process that patients go through for charity care. At General, I can't tell you I know all the nooks and crannies, but we have a financial counseling arm that does that. Right as you enter the hospital to the right, they do a lot of business in there. But there are as many patients that don't participate through that process as do, because they have to come back multiple times, bring information about where they live, and we take care of a lot of homeless patients, unfortunately, as well. And they're never going to qualify under charity unless they participate fully through that process. The other reality is Medicaid, TennCare, which is a big provider for us, does not pay anything close to what our costs are. So if you just look at charity, you're correct. You could buy it for less than the $40 million you see there. But for TennCare, and I suspect it's worse at the bigger hospitals, but typically pay 60 cents on the dollar. I mean, 60 cents cost at best, and probably much worse. I don't even know if Vanderbilt takes TennCare. It's a poor payer. So when we certify our certified public expenditure each year, which includes the cost of taking care of indigent patients and charity patients in our setting, the state then uses that to draw down federal money. And that number is 16, 17 million a year.
But there's a transfer, too, of some of that money outside of the Metro subsidy to general, too, right?
Yeah, but it's two sort of separate programs, but yes, that's true.
And that's meant to deal with the difference between the cost on Medicaid and TennCare and such, and it used to be a dish payment, too, on top of that, which is, I guess, sort of gone now, right?
Yes.
I guess I'm not in any respect opposed to providing the care that is being provided, but I will say that when I look at this and I see a number that says the charity care that we are providing to the public in our community has a cost to General Hospital of $15 million, and General Hospital is asking for $50 million plus, I'm like, well, that other $35 million is going somewhere. And to me, it's going, just intuitively I say, it's going to fixed overhead that is not being utilized. It's going to subsidize the people who refuse to participate for whatever reason in the charity program, or it is going to subsidize, God forbid, I hope this is not the case, to subsidize private insurers who are using our facility. So this, presenting numbers like this to the public is deeply problematic when it comes to asking them to contribute the funds necessary to maintain the enterprise. So I just, because I could walk out of this room and say, we're buying $15 million worth of care for $50 million. And I wouldn't be wrong.
You wouldn't be wrong as relates to the definition of a charity care
Right.
patient.
So that definition is deeply troubling. It is deeply troubling for policymakers in the city. So I would encourage some way to address a better way of presenting those numbers to the public.
We have some numbers that we will share, and I think they present a more balanced view than just focused on a single area of coverage for our patients.
If I may, so unbundling the estimated cost of providing charity care, that is sort of a standard cost approach. That's the marginal cost. I mean, does that include fixed costs in the hospitals, or is that entirely the marginal cost for in effect, the labor?
It's not
and the
marginal
supplies?
cost. I mean, it's based on a Medicare ratio cost of charge. That's sort of a standard in the hospital industry.
Okay.
And so ours is about 41 cents on the dollar of charge.
Okay.
So that's where I got to his 16.
You applied that metric.
I did, just for the sake of the discussion.
Okay, but for the reporting requirement, I guess, for F, footnote F, you have to presumably have to have footnote F.
Right.
Okay, so but that's your taking your hospital-wide estimate and then imputing that back to what the charity charges were.
Can I interrupt you just for a split second?
Please.
Do other facilities use that same definition of charity care? Does Vanderbilt?
I don't know. No, I mean, Vanderbilt, if they have a charity care program, it certainly can be different.
I think
St.
that's
Thomas, I'm a little bit more familiar with just because we deal a good bit just in the same geography. So theirs is, but they're all private, their own privately determined charity policy.
John, do you mind if I jump in?
Oh,
just to follow up on
please.
this?
No, no.
So I just want to make sure, it took me a while to understand the Vice Mayor's point. Usually I'm quicker on his points. So what I'm hearing, like when we talk about the hospital being a hospital of last resort for underprivileged people, people who can't get medical care elsewhere, I'm hearing you say that what's defined as charity care in the audit is just one category of people, of patients.
They're relatively small. Well, I mean, our charges for the year are about $240 million.
244 in total,
Right, so-
including that charity care.
Right,
Yes.
inclusive of.
Including that 40 million, it's not really.
But my insured business is substantially less than that. It's probably 120 million of those patients, of that 240, that has some form of insurance.
You say 120 out of 240, roughly?
Yes.
So if we corralled all the categories of people who can't afford care somewhere else,
Who can't afford.
who can't,
Okay.
that would be 120-ish?
Right, that's what I would say. It's about 50.
120 in charges,
Yes.
so the 15 would then go to 45?
To covering all the non-insured patients.
Well,
it
if you-
would cost.
Oh, you're saying 30% of the one, or 40% of the 120? Yeah, 48, yeah, that's right.
And there's another way to look at that, is that if you look back at my footnote D, it talks about self-pay insurers being, self-pay patients net of discounts being billed that they expected to get $40 million in there. But there's a $29.8 million reservation for bad debt. And so once you start moving all those numbers around, you end up getting to 45 or 50. Because, is that not right?
That's correct. You got it right.
So following up on the approach that the Vice Mayor used a little earlier, if we got this categories of people who weren't insured, whether they were charity or something else, and that came out to 45, 50 million of services, then to the Vice Mayor's point earlier, there's still another 5 or 10 million of the subsidy from Metro being used for something other than.
I wouldn't argue with that sort of logic, right?
And what's sort of the first 2 or 3 things come to mind that gets used
TennCare
for?
pays about 60% of our costs. And
No. What are the first 2 or 3 things that 5 or 10 million gets used for? Metro subsidy, you guys asking for 55. We just came up with about 45 being used to pay for care for poor people. The other 10 million.
Would that be
Still subsidized at TennCare, where we're only getting paid 60. We're not getting paid the full amount
for the insured patients.
For the insured patients.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Well, and then would that include, just following up on Bob's question, the professional services contract to Meharry for $6.1 million? Would that be that's a separate expense that we have that other hospitals don't have?
It is, but it's in there a little bit in defense of that PSA. Remember, they are delivering care to some of those patients as part of what the PSA pays.
As part of the 6.1 has some care in that. It's not all.
There definitely is. We pay them a little better than Medicare to take care of the indigent charity patients that they can't otherwise bill for.
Well, I mean, again, I think Bob hit the nail on the head. It's useful to foot back where the use of the subsidy is in losses, in expenses and losses. Right. That if you transferred that patient load to another hospital, what would their expected loss be?
Right.
What, so to speak, that, you're not depriving anybody of care, but if you said to everybody, you go over to St. Thomas, what level of losses would you be expecting St. Thomas then to be picking up? Cost. Well,
yeah, to me, the question is how would you determine the eligibility of those patients in that, whatever that fund is that,
in a different system.
Right, or some system that's run by Metro but can feed to any of the hospitals in the marketplace. How do they get qualified? Who does that? Just like an insurance company or a TPA does today. How does that happen? Because how you determine who the eligibles are will have a great impact on how big that fund needs to be. Rates are important, too, for all those hospitals who would participate, but until you tell them who meets eligibility and who will make that determination, it becomes, you may think general is inefficient or not effective, but I'm an old healthcare insurance guy, and I would be really concerned about sort of that unfunded mandate. I know you hear that in government. You have to determine who the eligibles are and what that future cost might be. And I promise you, we're cheaper per patient day right now than any other hospital in this market. Just because we're relatively small. You talk about overhead. I mean, Vanderbilt is a bigger institution. Their cost per patient day are going to be twice general. But we need them because we don't provide every service at general. So we still send some business out to Vanderbilt that we cannot provide because we either don't have that specialist or we don't do heart surgery at general. So we do that currently.
So if we were to take an average patient from general, send them to Vanderbilt, but say to Vanderbilt, you're not going to accept a larger cost or we will reimburse you for your costs, that could be a very big number.
It could be.
Okay. I mean, much larger than what our cost would be for that same patient. And then you can have a different discussion about whether that's better care, that cost represents better care because they have more tests and more specialists and more procedures that they're doing. Okay.
and we're talking a lot about inpatient. I just tell you, for those in the room, my greater concern is the ambulatory, because Vanderbilt, St. Thomas, they all take care of patients that present in their emergency departments. My concern is the patients who are diagnosed with a cancer by the Hardy Clinic, doctors that are Meharry physicians, but they work at our hospital. We do the infusion for those patients at General. And because, chemo, I'm sorry. Because we're a safety net hospital, we get 340B discount, so our pharmacy costs are about 30% below what we would buy in the market otherwise because of our 340B, because we handle enough low-income patients. And you only get 340B if you have inpatient hospital beds. That's the only way you can be eligible. So I just say those are the people that I worry the most about in this scenario, because people can come to General without the stigma of not having insurance, fearful to tell you that you don't have it, and they can keep getting their chemo. No disrespect, but that program that is talked about would have to be able to turn on really quickly so that a patient that's in care at General for infusion can then go to Vandy or St. Thomas or wherever and continue their treatment without a break in service. Just my view. So you can come and present. You don't have to be in the ED to get service. You can come get X-ray, lab, MR. Your physician, we get patients from these hospitals all the time that don't have insurance. They say, go to General, and they will take care of you. Well, they won't, if we're not there, they won't have that option.
If I may just, I want to just be sure to mention to the folks from the hospital that, so my questions haven't assumed the premise of sending patients elsewhere. I want to, like, my questions I'm asking are just trying to understand how some of these numbers about the cost for the charity care relate to the size of the subsidy. I don't feel like I've got enough information about what's going on to really have an opinion about where patients go. So I'm not meaning to comment on that with my questions in any way at all.
I didn't take offense. I was just trying to answer.
Sure.
We appreciate that. David, is there anything else?
No, not really. I mean, my presentation's done.
You know, that I thought this booklet was, you know, you probably do that every year, but that's very, very helpful. Very helpful. Okay, any other comments about that?
No, we just need to move to accept.
Okay.
Is that what we need to do?
So do we need a?
Where we are.
That's what, if you don't want to,
I would move to accept the CAFR.
Second.
All right.
And thank everybody
Absolutely.
involved. It's an amazing piece of work.
Okay, we'll just say, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
When's it going to go live on the website?
Yes, on the
10
stove
minutes?
tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Okay.
Thanks for all your work on that. I know it's a lot of work.
the only other item I have, I put up on page 23 of your workbook the proposed schedule for next year. It's based on our traditional way of working, meeting normally on the second Tuesday of the month. We've had 6 meetings scheduled for the year, spread out throughout the year, usually about every 2 months. Sometimes there's a bigger break in the summer. One that we used to do in July, I moved to late June, hopefully after the budget would be approved. So that was on June 26th.
A quick question, Mark. For putting things on the FY19 work plan, the date that needs to come to the committee and be submitted, is that?
That's February, the first meeting in the
First
year.
meeting in February would be to begin to
Right, and I'll put a
shape
call
up
out and work on that.
that 19 plan.
And trying to work on my ERM to do a better risk management process.
On the calendar, a couple things. One, have we got squared away what we're doing for compensation review, employment review?
That's why I moved to the June meeting, and then I'm supposed to give you some information before then, so in April we can discuss the review in June.
Okay, good. And then remind me how frequently we're looking at audit items completion date.
Recommendation follow-up.
Yeah.
We're every 6 months. So I'll
when's the
do
next
another
time
one of
we do
those in
that?
January. I will give you a report in February. I'll put a call out in the next week to
All right.
collect all the data in January, and then we do it again in July.
So-
Basically every 6 months. We used to do it annually. Now we do it 6 months because.
Excellent. The thing we talked about today about the fleet wasn't really connected to any audit item. We encouraged that she reach out to departments and see if they could make some sort of agreement. What's the best way for us to follow up on that? I mean, is that something that you're going to look at with the budget process?
We'll work with Mark in whatever way he
I
wants to
think
follow
we had
up on
an issue, a recommendation related to that, so I need to go back and make sure that's
So-
there.
so
But yes,
that'll-
then it's just a matter of us following up on the recommendation.
All right, so that we'll get to that in the second half of 2018
Right.
because she promised a completion date of June
Yeah,
2018.
well, I don't ask, I send it to them, but I don't ask for a response if it's not due yet.
Okay.
Can I just add a comment on that? And you probably won't believe that I'm going to say this, but I have found it useful to work with you, Councilman, in terms of legislative initiatives for certain things. This might be one of them we need to entertain to get some attention.
Well, I'm guessing.
So that people are paying attention. So I think I will have a conversation with the director about that.
I would like very much to not be viewed as chasing legislation that we don't need, but if there's a feeling from the administration that it would be helpful, then I'd be happy to.
I think I need to
pursue
have a
that.
follow-up conversation with her because I do know that, she does have some independent department heads out there that there may be some level of accountability that could be put into place that might be helpful for her.
If there's a.
I'd be the last person you'd expect to say that.
You know where to find it. You know where to find it. Yeah, I'm sorry, just one more scheduling thing. The following up with the short-term rental stuff is on your plan already
It's not on my plan. I was going to put it on the plan for
in the spring?
the annual. Well, I'll present it to you in February.
February.
It'll be on the list.
Because I think all their recommendation dates were,
Well, it's almost passed now, I think. We're close.
and anecdotally from the community, it's still the Wild West as far as getting permits.
It'll be there.
Which is bad.
The only other comment, I do owe Mr. Cooper one more response related to his question about funding for the ballpark. I'm still working on
okay.
it. Something
Thank
I'll
you.
let know. All right, that's all I have.
Okay, does this conclude meeting items? Then you mentioned that February 13th is our next meeting.
Yes, sir.
So now do we need just a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.org.